Since building the deck and my first time playing Shining Sarcophagus a few weeks ago, my experiences have been very positive. With some event tops, locals wins, and positive showcases, it's given me enough of a sample size to say that this is how I think Shining Sarcophagus should and can be played. In this video, I'll go over a more finalized deck profile from my last video with explanations for why I play what I play. If you have any opinions on how you play the deck, because I still think this deck is relatively unsolved, please share them in the comments down below. I'd love to read them. We'll start off the deck profile with the most essential normal summon in the deck, which is your 3 copies of Gadget Trio. Gadget Trio essentially turns your entire deck online by grabbing you access to Shining Sarcophagus. Shining Sarcophagus is the most important card of the deck, and Gadget Trio essentially is 3 additional copies of that card. If you open Shining Sarcophagus and the 3 copies of Gadget Trio, you essentially can get access to any other spell and trap card that lists Shining Sarcophagus, pretty much starting to develop your game state and building a board that goes in either into your opponent's board or building a board that your opponent has to go into themselves. Following up the Gadget Trio, we are playing 2 copies of Silent Magician 0 and 1 copy of Silent Swordsman 0. Now these cards have interesting applications into the deck. The reason why we are playing them at a low count is that both of them feel really poor to open up. Open in your starting 5 hands. Seeing Silent Swordsman 0 in your opening 5 feels absolutely terrible if you don't see exactly Shining Sarcophagus. In addition, Silent Magician 0 is kind of a similar niche. However, Silent Magician 0 is played at multiple counts because it's usually the go-to target after resolving Gandora. Both have decent applications when you set up a good board going first, and they do offer a lot of pressure when your opponent attempts to break or play into your board, which is really strong. However, I see a lot of deck profiles that essentially play these cards at multiples, whether they're multiples of 2 or multiples of 3. The reason why we are sticking to a very low level 4 count here is essentially that these cards are just awful to open up. You need the 5 cards in your hand to do something in this list with this deck, because every single interaction you play with this deck is very important, and having these cards to clog your opening hand doesn't feel very good at all. We aren't playing Marshmelon in addition because I don't think Marshmelon is fantastic in this deck. I don't think the battle phase is a resource that your opponent kind of yearns for when dealing with these boards, and Marshmelon essentially does nothing outside of the battle phase, which is why I don't think Marshmelon is very good at all. It is a very interesting card, and it has interesting interactions. I just don't think that it's viable at the highest level of Yu-Gi-Oh!, specifically when you're playing Shining Sarcophagus. Rounding off the Shining Sarcophagus monster cards, we are playing 2 copies of Gandora G, the Dragon of Destruction. Now, in my last deck profile, I claimed that I was going to start experimenting with this card at 3 because I do think this is the best monster in the archetype. I did experiment with it at 3, but the thing I found was the better I got with the deck, the less and less I needed the 3rd. I do believe that the more you play and figure out the different lines and applications the deck can do, the less and less you do see the 3rd, and the faster you can close out most games. Just having the 2 copies of Gandora I found was more than enough to supplement everything the deck wanted to do. In addition, what I think Gandora does, the thing that Gandora does that's most important for the list, is what it does is simplify the game state to a point where Shining Sarcophagus can start out-resourcing your opponent. This deck thrives when the game is very slow and your interactions are limited to 1 or 2 a turn, and that's when this deck is really strong. In the grind game, I think this deck does lack, but we do have a solution for that, and I will get to that when the cards come up. Moving on to the spell cards, we are playing 3 copies of the most important card in the entire archetype, which is Shining Sarcophagus. The entire deck revolves around resolving Shining Sarcophagus to essentially get access to the rest of your deck and the lines the deck wants to do, so that you can facilitate some sort of game state, whether you're going into an opponent's board or setting up your own. Shining Sarcophagus also has a very interesting effect that when your opponent attempts to special summon a monster from the graveyard, you essentially discard a spell card and negate that effect. We then follow up the spells by playing 3 copies of Future Silence. Future Silence essentially gives us access to Gadget Trio to enable the Shining Sarcophagus, and if we already have Gadget Trio, Future Silence gives us essentially access to the rest of the monster count in our deck. Typically, Future Silence also gives us access to Gandora, and things like that to essentially enable the rest of our plays going forward. In addition, Future Silence has tremendous synergy in the battle phase with a card like Silent Magician Zero. Now, this doesn't come up a lot, but Silent Magician Zero essentially allows Future Silence to help you push for game. By giving your opponent access to draw multiple cards, Silent Magician Zero does get the attack point boost to essentially allow you to put together a lethal shot. Now, in my runs at locals, the Future Silence secondary effect, where if you activate it in the battle phase, you and your opponent draw till you have 6 cards. Typically, that's not an effect you even want to consider, because you don't want to give your opponent 6 cards to start their turn. However, there are situations where I've played against decks like Snake Eyes, or even specifically like card decks like Vanquish Soul that have a very large count in their hands. So what Future Silence essentially allows it to do is give you a chance to replenish your hand, even though you give them 6 cards, but you're essentially becoming neutral on card advantage, and you essentially hope that the 6 cards you do draw can combat whatever they have already in their hand, right? So if you time Future Silence correctly, it can be an equalizer that's very, very important. The next Silent Sarcophagus spells we want to focus on are 2 copies of Ties That Bind. Ties That Bind is a very, very interesting card, and you'll see a lot of deck profiles online that play this card at 1. I don't fault anyone for playing this card at 1 because it's a card and a situation where you need a lot of setup for it to resolve. That being said, there are situations where you do want to see this card in your hand, and even though it's a situation where if you need it, you can grab it off of Gadget Trio, Shining Sarcophagus, things like that. But there are interactions where sometimes you open up a situation where you open one of Silent Magician or Silent Swordsman with Shining Sarcophagus, and you essentially need access to the rest of your engine. So what this card essentially does is it establishes a game state by itself. Sure, the setup is required, however, it gives you access to an entire board. It gives you access to a spell negate, a targeting protection, in addition, free bodies on the crackback, and with Gandora in hand. I do think Ties That Bind is very, very important. Even though a lot of players play it at 1, I can see the reasoning behind it. However, I do think playing it at 2 is correct for most situations. The next card we are looking at is 2 copies of Turn Silence, which in my opinion is the most underrated Shining Sarcophagus card, as Turn Silence, what it essentially does is if you open Shining Sarcophagus, any way to Gadget Trio, Gandora, Silent Magician, and anything like that, it essentially guarantees that your Shining Sarcophagus plays will resolve. If you normal summon a Gadget Trio, or for example, you just start with your Shining Sarcophagus, don't activating its effect, normal summoning Gadget Trio, searching your Turn Silence, or if you open Turn Silence, no matter what your opponent does, you can play through multiple hand traps with Turn Silence. In addition, in a format wherein Turn Silence is unbelievably insane into a matchup like Tenpai Dragon. Turn Silence in the graveyard is a non-activated effect to essentially end the battle phase, keeping your board untouched, which is unbelievable. This card single-handedly beats the Tenpai matchup, which is a very, very popular deck right now, and it's a fantastic pick into other matchups as well. In addition, what Turn Silence is more than anything, at its worst case, it's fantastic discard fodder, as what it does is it's the only card in the archetype that does something in the graveyard by itself. So that's it for the spell and trap card. That's it for the Shining Sarcophagus spell count. I do think that this is the correct ratios and correct ways to play it. I do think if there's one change that you can make is cutting Ties That Bind to 1. However, that's a conversation for further testing. No deck is without its flaws, and this deck is no different. Outside of its slow tempo, the biggest issue I have with this deck is essentially its resource management. Once your cards like Silent Magician 0, Swordsman 0, and even the Gandoras, once these cards get dealt with and are in the graveyard, it's almost impossible, and there's no in-archetype way to essentially recycle them, which makes this deck incredibly hard to play in the grind game, even though Silent Sarcophagus is a perfect card for the grind game, as it constantly gives you access to your resources. The problem is once your resources are dealt with, there's no recursion with this list. And the way we solve that problem is by playing Branded Fusion. We play your 3 copies of Branded Fusion and 1 copy of Fallen of Albaz. Now, Branded Fusion is a fantastic option. There are multiple engines you can play in substitute of Branded Fusion. For example, the Nadir Servant has seen tremendous success with this particular deck profile. In addition, Melodious and cards like Runic variants are also very, very viable with Shining Sarcophagus. All those options and engines are also fantastic options, but the reason why I like Branded Fusion over the rest of them is Branded Fusion allows you to pretty much recycle the cards needed to facilitate any sort of grind game. In addition, what Branded Fusion does, activating Branded Fusion as your first action immediately demands a response from your opponent. If Branded Fusion doesn't resolve, you're essentially free to play the rest of the game. You can activate your Gadget Trio, you could activate your Shining Sarcophagus and not be worried about too many additional interruptions. In addition, Branded Fusion does lock you out of the extra deck, but it doesn't matter because you're not really going into the extra deck with this list anyways. Now, the question I do have is if I want to play Fallen of Albaz at 2. The answer is I probably will play it at 2 for the time being. However, during my locals runs where I've found tremendous success, I have been playing the 1 copy of Dark Magician, only to facilitate Dragoon, because I think Dragoon works under Gandora better than any other card you can make with these supplementing engines, whether it's Runic, whether it's Melodious, whether it's Nadir. Just having access to a Dragoon applies unbelievable amounts of pressure going into a lot of boards, as well as establishing board on your own. Pairing a Dragoon with, for example, your Shining Sark, a Turn Silence, in addition for a Silent Magician 0 and a Silent Swordsman 0 with a few hand traps, that's just unbelievable. That's why I think that the Dark Magician isn't a very good Garnet. However, it is mandatory if you want to play the Dragoon. Now, you don't need to play the Dark Magician. You can play 2 copies of Fallen of Albaz. I did find myself not really going into Dragoon as much in my most recent locals runs, which makes me question whether or not Dark Magician is the viable play. So you can run 2 copies of Fallen of Albaz, which can be very, very good, or you could just play the 1. I think this is okay. However, for the list I have been playing the Dark Magician, but like I said, this can be substituted into something else. Moving on to the consistency cards, we are just playing the 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity. I used to play Extrav in this particular list. I think Desires can be also okay, but Desires, there's just a little too many 1-ofs and 2-ofs in the list to warrant playing Desires. I think Extravagance is fantastic because Extravagance essentially gives you an extra card, which is really, really strong. However, what I found was you need to dig through and find Shining Sarcophagus. If you can't see Shining Sarcophagus in your opening hand, it feels really, really bad. In addition, what Pot of Prosperity allows you to do is if you already have Shining Sarcophagus, you can just Pot of Prosperity and find an additional piece to your combo, whether it's a Gadget Trio or a Turn Silence that allows your Gadget Trio to essentially resolve going into a lot of boards. That can be very beneficial. Pot of Prosperity is fantastic. Banishing 6 from your extra deck really doesn't matter, as you don't really go into the extra deck that much, and just giving you access to find your combo pieces is really, really important with this list. Moving on to the main reason why we don't play those additional engines, we are playing the best hand trap in the game, which is 3 copies of Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter, seeing Dimension Shifter in your hand pretty much guarantees that you are winning a lot of your matchups. Shifter is the best hand trap in the game if your deck can play it, and it's the main reason why we're not playing cards like Nadir Servant, cards like Runic variants, and Melodious variants. The reason why is Shifter turns off all those archetypes, and it's what makes Branded Fusion very, very viable in this particular list. Branded Fusion plays under Shifter incredibly well, and just having access to, for example, just Dragoon and having your opponent being shifted for their turn can be the difference maker in winning the game. This deck can play under Shifter fantastically well, and what it also allows you to do is just turns off a lot of the best decks in the format. We follow up the hand trap count with 3 copies of Ash Blossom and 3 copies of Infinite Impermanences. These are very, very standard. They're just really generic, really good into every other matchup. Ash isn't amazing right now. However, I do think it's pretty mandatory. The next card is a little controversial because it does conflict with Shifter, but this card is just way too good to pass up on. We are playing 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet. Forbidden Droplet is one of the best cards, specifically in this list, going into boards. You activate Pot of Prosperity or Future Silence and then chain your Forbidden Droplet. It just deals with 1 problematic monster on board. In addition, just having a board setting Droplet for your opponent's turn is just unbelievable with this particular list. Rounding off the deck, we are playing 2 copies of Triple Tactics Talents. Triple Tactics Talents is a fantastic option if, for example, you get interrupted on your plays. You could either draw 2 to generate more advantage and hopefully set up a board like that. In addition, it's fantastic into breaking a lot of boards. A lot of decks are ending on like Appaloosa, just talents, take their Appaloosa, and you are pretty much having 2 free monster negates to back up whatever remaining plays you have, which is really strong. In addition, just remember the Shining Sarcophagus cards, they don't have a lot of interactions on your opponent's turn, right? So what talents allows you to do is gives you information on your opponent's hand so that you can play your interactions very correctly. I think talents is just one of the best board breakers and going second cards in the game right now, and I think it's too important not to play. So that's it for the main deck. We will quickly move on to the extra deck and the side deck that I have been playing. One thing to note about this particular list is that your extra deck really doesn't matter. You can play 15 flex spots. Whatever your side engine you play, we play branded, so we are playing some branded cards. However, whatever your sub engine is, whether it's Nadir, Runic, Melodious, whatever side engine you're playing, that's kind of the direction your extra deck wants to take. So for this particular list, we are going to be playing the 1 copy of Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, 1 Lubellion, 1 Albion, 1 Sanctifier, and 1 Mirror Jade. Now, these cards are essentially just for branded fusion. Lubellion pretty much allows you to recur any and all assets. However, the rest of this extra deck, what I wanted the most out of this extra deck was essentially having value off the rest of your cards. How can I make value off this extra deck that's more than just banishing 6 off Prosperity? And I think we've done a very, very good job of that. SP Little Knight is the one generic option in the grind game. Just having enough bodies on board to go into SP Little Knight is really, really strong. Even if you just go talents, take their monster, you make an SP Little Knight, is just really, really strong. Moving these out of the way, the one thing I do want to say is that our side deck does play Super Poly. We play 3 copies of Super Poly in the side deck, which immediately means that our extra deck does have some Super Poly targets where we play Predaplant, Dracos Tapelia, Garura, Mud Dragon, and for the Yubel matchup, we play the Yubel Fusion. As going into the Yubel board, you just Super Poly their entire board away into the Yubel Fusion, and you apply pressure that way. It's a 1-card board wipe, which is really, really strong. The next card I want to go into in the side deck that has performed exceptionally above where I think it should have been is Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. We play 3 copies of Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, which allows us to utilize different variants in the extra deck to counter specific matchups. So we do play the 1 copy of Yama for any sort of Fiends, Unchained decks like that. I think getting rid of Yama in an Unchained match is unbelievable. In addition, Promethean Princess, getting rid of Promethean Princess in the Snake Eyes matchup is hugely beneficial. In addition, the Bided Dragon for Tenpai, just getting rid of this card in the Tenpai matchup is unbelievable. It pretty much turns off their entire plays, which is really, really strong. And then finally, for the Brandon matchup, we are getting rid of Granguignol, or you can even get rid of, for example, we do play a branded package, so Cherries essentially does act as an interruption for any one of these 4 cards, right? If you are getting puppet locked, you can hit the Sanctifier, you can hit the Lubellion, because essentially hitting Lubellion turns off all their dark monsters from the deck, even a Mirror Jade or something along those lines. The final card is Crimson Dragon, as Crimson Dragon essentially enables your opponent to Calamity Lock you. So just hitting Crimson Dragon pretty much turns off the Calamity Lock and any sort of locks like that. So I think Ghost Reaper throughout the testing, I know it's a very niche pick and it's not the most favorite hand trap. However, this card has come up an unbelievable amount of times in the multiple locals I have been testing it at. Just hitting a lot of Cherry strength comes in preparation. So if you know what your locals is on, I do recommend you just trying Ghost Reaper if you're playing this list. The extra deck is so flexible, so I thought why not try to utilize the extra deck in ways where I can counteract the format and things like that. Another option you can play is Ultimate Slayer. That's also a fantastic option. However, I thought Ghost Reaper was just a little bit more funny. It's more specific. It's definitely, I put it in as a meme initially, but it did overperform when I did see it. So I think that's something that you can experiment with. It is a very, very interesting card, and it's been a lot of fun to play with it. We follow up the side deck with the 2 copies of Bestial Boldrake, 1 copy of Bestial Boldrake and 1 copy of Bestial Magnema. These 2 cards are fantastic into the Puppet Lock and things like that. So we have a lot of, it's fantastic into Brandon matchup. and other matchups like that. Meg also searches you Gandora, which is really, really strong. We follow up with one copy of Jowgen the Spiritualist. This is essentially if you don't think that going into a Snake Eyes board, obviously I don't think Dragoon is the most ideal option. You can make main deck Jowgen, but seeing Branded Fusion, you could pretty much just set up a Jowgen lock, which is really, really strong. I think you could just hard make a Sanctifier and then Sanctifier bring back the Jowgen, locking your opponent out of special summoning. So Jowgen is very, very interesting. You can substitute this also with like a Gimmick Puppet if you really, really want to. But there is a lot of interesting interactions. I think the deck is very, very slow, so just limiting your opponent from playing completely can be very beneficial. We do follow up the side deck with 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone. Back row hate is very, very important, as a lot of variants are playing. There's a lot of stun variants. This card is really good into the Voiceless Voice matchup. There's just a lot of matchups where Cosmic Cyclone excels tremendously. The final card in the deck is another Floodgate. We do play 3 copies of Secret Village. As you open up Shining Sarcophagus and Secret Village, you essentially get access to Ties That Bind, and then pretty much Village plus Silent Magician 0 is fantastic. It's a great lock that locks your opponent out of special summoning monsters from activating spell cards completely. In addition, you guys know how much I love Village and Branded Fusion, because you pretty much just end on Secret Village and a Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, which pretty much ends a lot of duels on its own. That's it for the deck profile. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you changed in the comments down below, and have yourself an amazing day. Bye.